What if everything we think we know about the edges of civilization is backwards? Because long before pyramids rose from Egyptian sand, before the first bricks of Babylon were laid, there were humans, barefoot and bold, stepping off the edge of the known world and into Papua. Not with steel, not with maps, with nothing but instinct and the ocean. 50,000 years ago, before there was Europe to write history, their ancestors had already crossed the sea. Not by accident, by design. Island to island, current to current, over hundreds of kilometers of open water, to a place we now call Papua New Guinea. They didn't just survive there. They stayed. And here's the paradox that no textbook ever prepared you for. While empires came and fell, while the rest of the world forgot who it once was, these people remembered. Their DNA carries echoes of a time so ancient, it's barely human. 4 to 6% Denisovan. A ghost species. A cousin of Neanderthals. Extinct but not quite. Still pulsing in the veins of the highlands. Still whispering through immunity genes and brain pathways we've only just begun to decode. This isn't tribalism. This is time travel and blood. These aren't relics of the Stone Age. They're the guardians of a memory no one else kept. The original voyagers. The ones who made it when no one else even knew how far the ocean went. But ask anyone on the street today, and what do they call Papuans? Primitive, isolated, remote. They crossed seas before your ancestors carved wheels. So why does no one tell their story? What force buried 50,000 years of resilience beneath silence? And if they've been here since the beginning, unchanged, unmoved, unforgotten, then one question remains. Why did the world forget them? And what else did we leave behind on the shores of Sahul? Somewhere deep in the jungle, just beyond the last mountain fog, you'll hear a voice. Then another, and then another, completely different. Each one ancient, sharp, unrelated, not dialects, entire languages, 800 of them, on one island. That's not an error. That's not exaggeration. Papua New Guinea, 1/10 the size of Europe, holds 20% of the world's languages. And yet, almost no one can explain why. Linguists call it a miracle, or a nightmare, or both. But the truth? It's not chaos. It's design. Because this wasn't just accidental drift. It was a strategy. For 50,000 years, Papuan clans built invisible fences using language. They weren't trying to unify. They were trying to survive. No shared empire. No capital tongue. Just villages, tribes, and a rule older than kings. Speak your way apart. If you could speak 3 languages, you traded. If you couldn't, you stayed home. And if you married outside your group, you risked more than gossip. You risked breaking the chain of ancestral blood. Now, compare that to the Austronesian wave. Thousands of islands, one language family, spreading from Taiwan to Tahiti like wildfire. But Papua resisted that fire. Even when Lapidus sailors arrived with boats and pigs and polished tongues, they didn't burn through. They lingered on the coast, while the highlands kept whispering in 800 different ways. And the deeper you listen, the stranger it gets. Because not all these tongues are cousins. Many are orphans, isolates, unrelated to anything, anywhere. Some contain grammar that feels alien. Others have sounds no human language should logically retain. And then there's one, a language family buried so deep in the highlands, it doesn't link to Austronesian, or even to other Papuan roots. It might be a fossil, a fingerprint from a migration older than memory. But what people spoke it? And if even their words survived the mountains, what else did they leave behind? The world thinks the first farmers lived beside the Tigris, or maybe along the Nile. But what if the first fields weren't dug in the desert, but carved into the clouds? 9,000 years ago, in the green lungs of New Guinea, a people we still barely understand turned swamp into system. Cook Swamp, a name soft on the tongue, but beneath its mud lies something radical. Irrigation ditches, hand-cut into volcanic soil. Raised garden beds, fed by rain and runoff. Taro, bananas, sugarcane, planted with no wheel, no ox, no iron. Before pyramids, before writing, before the idea of civilization had even been whispered. And who did this? Not kings, not priests, but the highland clans, isolated, invisible, and yet utterly free. Their tools were carved bone. Their soil sacred. They weren't waiting for history to find them. They were growing futures, one root at a time. But this isn't just a story of plants. It's written in blood. Inside their DNA, a hidden upgrade, millions of years old. A Denisovan legacy, fused deep in the Papuan genome. Not just a relic, but a reason. These genes help them digest fats from plants, converting jungle starch into strength. Where mammoths once roamed elsewhere and vanished, Papuans stayed. They didn't chase megafauna. They tamed the earth beneath their feet. In mountain air that steals your breath, they evolved red blood cells that carry more oxygen, more life. Not just adapted, optimized. Because here, in the silence of stone axes and wooden terraces, they built a world no one could invade. And for 30,000 years, the highlands held their breath. No roads, no war horses, just fog, and rhythm, and generations of roots. But then, one day, sails appeared on the horizon. Not Roman galleys, not conquistadors. Something else. Outsiders, with boats, and pigs, and polished pottery. But what happened next, no one expected. They didn't burn the gardens. They didn't conquer the peaks. They paused, because even the newcomers knew they had found something older than memory, and something they couldn't quite understand. Not yet. They came riding the sea, not with armies, but with firepots and fruit trees. Lapita, Austronesian voyagers, born of coral routes and starlit maps, gliding across the Pacific with pigs and baskets and ancestry in their sails. They reached Papua's shores 3,300 years ago. They brought pottery with dentate stamps, signatures of distance. They brought bananas, chickens, stories. But here's the twist, they stopped. Not literally. They built homes. They planted gardens. They lived on the same islands as the Papuans. But they didn't mix. Not for 1,000 years. Not a single drop of DNA crossed between them, for a millennium. Think about that. Two peoples, two worlds, cooking over the same firewood, watching the same tides rise. But something invisible, stronger than war, kept them apart. Wadham Island proves it. Ancient skeletons buried with care, their skulls carefully reshaped, foreheads flattened, crowns elongated. A ritual, an identity carved into bone. But the blood inside those skulls? Still entirely Papuan. No Austronesian trace, even though Lapita pottery lay beside them, in the very same graves. Science expected fusion, but found separation. Not just cultural, genetic. Why? Was it taboo? Territory? Memory? What kind of boundary holds stronger than hunger, trade, desire? One that isn't drawn on the land, but burned into the soul. Because this wasn't distance. This was deliberate. A millennium of silence, in the midst of contact. Not war, not isolation, just an invisible wall. Maintained, preserved, protected, until something, finally, centuries later, cracked it. But what was that force? What shift was powerful enough to bring two civilizations into the same body after 1,000 years apart? Beneath the jungle silence of Wadham Island lie the bones of a contradiction. They rest in volcanic soil, curled, buried, honored. Beside them, shards of pottery shimmer with a telltale design, lapita, the fingerprint of Austronesian arrival, which means this graveyard should hold their descendants. Right? It doesn't. Scientists ran the tests. Again, then again. Every single skull, 100% Papuan. Not a trace of Austronesian blood. Not after 50 years. Not after 500. And here's where it gets stranger. These weren't just buried. They were shaped. Their heads flattened in youth. Skulls bound tight to change their form. A ritual. A declaration. Long foreheads, sloped crowns, identity, etched in bone. And still no intermarriage. No blending. No fusion. Even though Austronesian neighbors lived just meters away. Even though lapita pots sat right there in the dirt. A gift, an echo, a signal. The message was clear. You can trade with us. Eat with us. Die beside us. But you will not become us. And we will not become you. What kind of memory can last that long? What kind of story do you pass down? Not through words, but through the shape of your children's skulls. not myth, not metaphor. A boundary so deeply carved, not even time erases it. DNA confirmed the silence. And in that silence, we found a people speaking with bones, not with monuments, but with marrow. And yet, Wadham is not alone. There are other coasts, other rivers, other clans, and in some of them, a puzzle even stranger. Not just separation between worlds, but separation within the same one. Because sometimes, even neighbors are strangers. Even now. 10 kilometers. That's the distance between two coastal villages on Papua's southern rim. You could walk it barefoot in under 2 hours. Same soil, same rain, same tides brushing the same shoreline. But for 500 years, they never shared blood. Zero genetic overlap. Not one marriage. Not one child. Not one night where one crossed into the other's world. Scientists checked the genomes, generation after generation. And what they found wasn't drift. It was division. Two peoples, side by side, but genetically sealed. No wall. No war. Just a boundary you couldn't see, but could never step past. And the question is why? What defines identity, if not distance? When the rivers don't block you, but memory does. Maybe it was ritual. Maybe the gods lived in different trees, wore different masks, danced to different drums. Maybe a single story, told just once too often, kept them apart forever. Or maybe it was fear, not of each other, but of what blending might erase. Because when the climate turned and rains grew cruel, people didn't migrate. They pulled in. They retreated to what they knew, to the familiar scent of their own fires, to kin, to clan, to caution. And sometimes, the tighter you hold onto identity, the less you let anyone else inside it, even if they live just beyond the hill. Even if their songs echo yours in the dark. Because here's the paradox. The closer we are, the sharper we draw our lines. And in those lines, stories calcify, genomes diverge, and kinship becomes selective. So what does that say about us? About how we define we? About the people we think are ours, and the ones we quietly leave outside the circle? If even neighbors built walls, what does that say about the rest of us? For centuries, the story ran one way, from west to east, from Asia to the Pacific. Austronesians sailing outward, carrying language, animals, maps carved in stars. And Papuans, they were written as the ones who stayed behind, rooted, isolated, inland, until the genomes told a different story. In the islands of Wallacea, tucked between New Guinea and the Indonesian archipelago, a quiet surprise surfaced. Papuan ancestry. Not a trickle. Not a trace. Whole strands. Whole lineages. Not flowing in, but flowing out. From New Guinea. Backwards. It wasn't just the Austronesians riding the waves. It was the Papuans, too. Sailing west. Long before colonizers named them primitive. Long before textbooks flattened them into tribes. They were moving. Trading. Navigating. Not by compass, but by current, moonlight, and memory. And they weren't just passing through. They left blood, in the veins of modern Wallachians, in the genomes of eastern Indonesia, in dialects that carry Papuan rhythms beneath Austronesian syllables. This wasn't resistance. It was return, a migration against the wind and against the myth. Because the story of human movement was never one road, one arrow, one culture carrying others. It was chaos, loops, echoes, and in those echoes, the truth. That seafaring didn't belong to just one people. It was stitched into many skins. And Papuans, far from being left behind, helped stitch the ocean itself. So the question isn't just how far they went. It's how many stories they left, unrecognized, in other people's roots. Because if they sailed west once, where else did they go? And what other bloodlines still whisper their names? They were never supposed to last. The Denisovans, a vanished branch of humanity. No ruins. No cave paintings. No legacy carved in stone. Just a fragment. A tooth. A whisper of bone dust in the back of a Siberian cave. Extinct. Forgotten. Except they aren't gone. Not in Papua. Because here, in the blood of modern Highlanders, their shadow lives on. For 5, sometimes 6%. the highest Denisovan ancestry on Earth, more than anywhere in Asia, more than the Himalayas. And this isn't just genetic debris. It's code, living code, genes for altitude, not copied from Tibetans, but evolved on a parallel track, genes for lipid metabolism, converting roots and greens into fuel when the megafauna disappeared, genes for immunity, ancient weapons against tropical bacteria, sharpened long before science had a name for infection. These weren't inherited by accident. They were selected, kept, rewritten over generations, not because the Denisovans were stronger, but because the Papuans made them useful. They didn't carry ancient DNA like baggage. They built with it. They fused it into their architecture. And that changes everything. Because we don't just come from survivors. We come from editors, from ancestors who looked at their genes and quietly began to sculpt, to adapt, to perfect. While the world forgot their names, their blood remembered what mattered. And that blood, right now, is still at work. In neurons, in lungs, in the way a Highlander breathes at 2,000 meters, without flinching. It's the ghost of a vanished species, thriving in bodies that outlived empires. But here's the mystery. We've mapped the shape of that legacy, but not its full design. There are alleles we still can't explain, functions we've only glimpsed. So the question isn't what they carried. It's what they left behind, waiting to be read. Because inside Papuan DNA, there are chapters still sealed, and stories not yet awakened. It started with a shard, no bigger than a thumb. Baked clay, faint ridges, a motif etched in fire. But this wasn't just pottery. It was a voice, one that had crossed oceans. Because this fragment, found deep in Gulf of Papua soil, matched pieces unearthed in Australia's Torres Strait, over 400 kilometers away. The same curves, the same texture, the same human hand, echoed across waves. And suddenly, the myth of isolation cracked. Papuans weren't static. They weren't landlocked. They were sailors. Their canoes, heavy with pots, sago starch, smoked fish, and secrets, carved paths across sea foam. This was the Hiri network. Not a myth. Not a footnote. A 2,000-year-old maritime circuit, threading through the coral sea like arteries. Motu potters from the south coast, launching seasonal expeditions, with clay cargo stacked like treasure. Timber came back. So did ceremonial bark, resin, rumors. But the real trade was in connection, because these pots didn't just hold food. They held language, symbol, aesthetic memory. Even today, their spirals and stamps echo in carvings, tattoos, and funeral drums. Proof that identity moved by boat, not border. What if what we once called remoteness was actually resistance? What if every island wasn't a boundary, but a waypoint? Not ends of the world, but bridges disguised as edges. And if the Hiri canoes sailed that far, how much further did the first ones go? Because the deeper researchers dig, the older the puzzle gets. A style here, a gene there. Signals pointing backwards, but never quite pointing home. One shard leads to another, but one piece, one origin, still won't reveal itself. Because before the pottery, before the trade routes, before the stories etched in clay, there were feet on sand. And no one yet knows whose feet they were, or where they truly began. For decades, they said it was impossible. That Papua, with its heat, its rot, its relentless jungle decay, would never give up its dead. Not to science, not to time. DNA, they said, doesn't survive in the tropics. But then it did. Buried deep beneath rainforest soil, beneath centuries of silence, a fragment emerged. A tooth. Not much to look at. But inside it, a genome. Ancient. Intact. A 2,500-year-old Papuan, preserved against all odds. The first of its kind. Recovered, sequenced, resurrected. And suddenly, what once seemed lost forever began to whisper. This wasn't just biology. It was memory. Inside the spirals of that double helix, culture lingered. You could see the highlands in it. You could trace immunity, metabolism, ancestral migration. Each a thread spun long before ink met parchment. This wasn't just a data point. It was a person. A heartbeat frozen in time, now pulsing again inside fluorescent tubes. And the lab, lit soft and blue, felt more like a temple than a workspace. vials glowing like fireflies, screens flashing ancestral maps, and in the corner, a DNA strand flickering beside an image of a warrior tattoo, hand-carved, crescent-eyed, a face from 2 millennia ago, unburied by code. This was no longer about bones. It was about voice. The things not spoken, but inherited. And the idea, the electrifying, terrifying idea, that inside the sequence might lie dreams, tastes, grief, the weight of a mountain trail carried by someone whose name was never written, but whose blood still flows. What if we're not just finding ancestors? What if we're reading them? What if that genome is a diary, sealed in flesh instead of ink? And if we can read one, how many more are still buried, waiting to speak? 50,000 years. That's how long they've been here. Longer than the ice retreated. Longer than the wheel. Longer than memory itself. And in that time, the earth forgot. Tropical heat erased bones. Rain dissolved the ash of fire pits. Languages faded like mist. But one thing endured. Their blood. Not as myth. Not a story. As genome. The people didn't write history. They became it. Each child, each mother, each clan, carrying codes older than nations. And while the world told its stories in books and ruins, the Papuans whispered theirs in chromosomes. Every cell a line, every lineage a chapter. And somehow, against every erosion of time, the archive still lives. Not buried under stone. Walking, speaking, breathing. You could sit beside them on a bus and never know you were beside one of the oldest living records on Earth. Because history isn't always behind us. Sometimes it walks beside us. And if DNA remembers what the land erased, then what, exactly, are we preserving in our own? Is identity something we inherit, or something we defend? Across silence, across forgetting, across generations who may never know your name, but will still carry your scars? 50,000 years of memory didn't survive because of tools. It survived because of choice. To stay. To remember. To pass forward. Even when no one was listening. But now we are. So the question isn't whether Papuan DNA remembers. It's what ours will someday reveal. When the data is dusted off, and someone maybe far from now finds your genome glowing in a lab, what story will they read? What truth will they whisper? And what part of you will still be alive? If you believe DNA still holds untold histories, subscribe. There are more voices buried in blood, and we've only just begun to listen.